Cuarta delegación de víctimas del conflicto armado.
2014 was a historic year for Colombia's peace process, with the participation of delegations representing victims of all of the armed actors involved in an internal conflict stretching back nearly 70 years. The victims were selected following 3 regional victims forums and a national forum staged by the National University in Bogotá, the United Nations and the Catholic Church.
Never before in an armed conflict have negotiators listened to the voices of the victims, nor has space for their participation has been guaranteed, and has happened in the case of Colombia.
In total, 5 delegations of 12 victims each attended the process, with a widespread message of support for the talks expressed among them.
I think these spaces have been very important because in general, the victims have expressed that they agree with seeking a political exit to the armed conflict, that they don't want to continue with the war, that they don't want more victims to be produced.
That participation has sparked hope among victims and Colombian society in general for an end to decades of hostilities.
My hope, and that of the majority of the Colombian people at this moment, is that they come to an agreement for an end to the armed conflict, that from their work can have some killer mechanism to initiate a long-term process of construction of peace. And also I think we have hope that Colombian society will involve itself in supporting the agreements. Hopefully people understand that the endorsement will be the opening of a larger discussion on the changes that this country needs.
In June, President Juan Manuel Santos won re-election in a result that was largely seen as an endorsement of the peace process by the Colombian people. His opponent in the runoff, Oscar Iván Zuluaga, had run on a staunch anti-peace negotiations ticket, and his Democratic Centre Party, with ex-President Álvaro Uribe as its figurehead, remains vocally opposed to the talks.
Those with the more extreme views also often have the louder public voice, and the majority who really want peace, who want this to succeed, who are willing to compromise to see success, aren't always adequately heard. So I hope their voices will be better heard in 2015, and I hope with their encouragement the negotiations will reach a successful conclusion.
While victims and high-profile supporters of the peace have experienced death threats and intimidation as part of an attempt from extreme right-wing elements to derail the process, they have remained unshakable in supporting the talks and hope to persist that a final agreement will be signed in 2015.
The streets of Caracas are now the image of calm. It's hard to believe that less than a year ago they were part of the nationwide explosion of the so-called barricades. The violent opposition roadblocks cost the lives of 44 people after opposition politicians Leopoldo López and Maria Corina Machado called on supporters to take to the streets. They were reported as spontaneous by the international media, but for Desiree Cabrera, whose daughter was trapped inside a nursery set alight by the barricaders, it's not a story she recognises.
It was horrible. It wasn't just my daughter, there were lots of babies inside. In the middle of all that panic, watching them attack and set the centre on fire, we had to get all of those children out as part of an emergency operation.
Desiree isn't the only one to have suffered. 65-year-old Maria Barrera had to be evacuated after barricaders stormed her house and threatened to burn her alive. Her whole community was without access to gas and regular food for over a month.
The National Guard found out and they turned up with a tank. They came to get us out. We couldn't leave until they had dispersed them because they really were coming for us.
The barricades were not the end of the story. They were followed by the release of a string of videos showing right-wing terror plotter Laurent Salem confessing to having participated in planning the barricades in advance from Colombia. He and several others were receiving military training and funding there. The case was being investigated by youth leader and United Socialist Party legislator Robert Serra, assassinated shortly after the videos were released. For Farid Freiha, author of the book Plan Barricade, 2014 has been marked by attempts to overthrow the government in a soft coup.
Strategies which may way for sustained, low-intensity actions through civilian clashes, the introduction of paid mercenaries and groups into the country who began to generate violence in order to justify military intervention.
Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has described 2014 as the most difficult year yet for the Bolivarian revolution. Yet the government appears to have weathered the storm. It hopes that 2015 will be a year of greater stability for the Bolivarian Republic. Rachel Boothroyd for teleSUR in Caracas, Venezuela.
may have started with the death of Michael Brown in 2014, but it didn't end there. In August, during the days and weeks after white police officer Darren Wilson shot and killed the unarmed 18-year-old in Ferguson, police used tear gas and armored cars to break up mass protests, arresting dozens of citizens, including journalists. September. Shortly after a grand jury begins reviewing evidence into whether to indict Wilson, the Justice Department gets involved.
In Ferguson, our investigation will assess the police department's use of force, including deadly force.
October. Activists organize a weekend of collective actions demanding justice for Michael Brown. Meanwhile, Darren Wilson remains on paid administrative leave.
It's the power and the energy of Michael Brown, you know. His spirit's still gonna live on. We're gonna carry his name on. No one will forget.
The St. Louis County prosecutor
November. The grand jury wraps up its investigation, and Missouri Governor Jane Nixon declares a state of emergency, activating the National Guard. On the night of November 24th, County Prosecutor Bob McCulloch announces that Darren Wilson will face no criminal charges, igniting a second wave of protests and destruction, this time nationwide.
It's deeply resonating with people, and I understand, and it feels good to know that everybody feels the same way we feel.
December. President Obama pledges millions of dollars in police body cameras to alleviate the situation. Activists say police violence in communities of color has become normalized, and protests won't stop until there's real justice. Alexandra Hall, teleSUR, Washington.
The major international event of the year for Bolivia was the country's hosting of the United Nations G77 plus China summit, held in the eastern city of Santa Cruz in June.
The Summit of Head of States in Bolivia for the G77 is the largest international event that we have had in the history of our country. And for us it marks a milestone because aside from demonstrating that Bolivia, the plurinational state of Bolivia, has the capacity to receive 133 delegations from different countries, it is also capable of generating a proposal, the resolution document that has been very important in many different areas.
The Group of 77 at the United Nations was formed as a coalition of developing Global South countries seeking to promote collective interests. This year's summit was the 50th anniversary of the group, and President Evo Morales' inaugural speech highlighted the need to create a global brotherhood of peoples.
I think that Evo Morales and the Bolivian people are a sign of hope for many peoples in the world who are struggling for equality, for access to basic services, and for the redistribution of wealth.
In addition to hosting the G77 summit, Bolivia is currently constructing the future site of the parliament for the regional UNASUR bloc in the city of Cochabamba, as the country continues to play a greater role in international diplomacy. Reporting from La Paz, David Doherty, teleSUR.
Behind the vulture funds exists a complex framework of concentrated and speculative interests that go against sovereign countries who seek economic independence.
Both on the part of the executive power in the White House and in the legislature and the judiciary.
The vulture funds have a dominant and concentrated position worldwide, with assets in mining, oil and technology companies, just to name a few.
Vulture funds are anonymous but represent specific capital. Shall we say highly concentrated capital? Although not as public as Google or such enterprises, but they move in the fields of high finance. What they do is demonize Argentina through financing, through the American Task Force website, where they openly say that Argentina's economy is headed for disaster. They broadcast the opinion of people such as former Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo. They publicize energy specialists who say that they will not leave the business of Vaca Muerta shale gas reservoir to Russia nor China. The framework below the vultures are American financial interests, who want to continue with financial speculation and with NATO military expansionism, which they have unfolded throughout Eurasia and the Malvinas Islands, also supported by the English military budget.
The vulture fund's mode of action, buying cheap bonds from nations close to defaulting on debt, and then demanding payback of a larger amount than the purchasing price, is functional to US foreign policy, which seeks to derail sovereign countries who seek economic independence. From Buenos Aires, Leonel Poblete Coduti, teleSUR.
A national park of nearly 1 million hectares, the Yasuni has been called the most biodiverse area on the planet. It is home to 40% of all animals calling the Amazon basin home and 1,762 identified species of trees and shrubs. It also has large crude oil reserves that the government deems as necessary to exploit, as it would generate revenues of $20 billion to finance national development and reach the goals of good living. At the inauguration of one of his Millennium Schools in the Amazon on November 6th, President Rafael Correa said that responsible exploitation will affect merely 120 hectares of the park.
With this oil, we can build this class of schools. Now, with our oil, transforming it into education, in spectacular schools, millennium schools for the territories where these riches come from. This black gold, my countrymen.
The state oil company, Petroamazonas, has been put in charge of the project and has committed to extracting in a responsible manner. The company will install a maximum of 12 oil platforms in what are known as blocks 31 and 43. Ecuadorian law demands that 12% of the revenue stay within the affected zone in an effort to benefit the surrounding communities.
What we have said as Petroamazonas is that we undertake projects in a sustainable way, using environmentally friendly technologies and respecting nature, because this is our home. We are a group of Ecuadorians that are undertaking projects for Ecuadorians.
With mixed public support, President Correa gave the go-ahead on exploitation in August of last year, following the failed appeal to the international community through the Yasuni ITT initiative for contributions totaling $3.6 billion in exchange for leaving oil in the ground. It is expected that by March 2016, the first 10,000 barrels will be extracted in the camp of Tiputini. The official calculation is that 920 million barrels will be extracted in total, the revenues of which will go towards building Millennium Schools and undertaking other projects furthering national development. Liz Sherfius, teleSUR, Ecuador.
During his second State of the Union speech in September, Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto applauded the end of a turbulent period in the country's politics, which saw the passage of an unprecedented number of structural reforms.
There are 11 transformative reforms that constitute the foundation in building a new Mexico in the coming years.
Yet the question for many was and remains, who will truly benefit from these changes to the energy sector, agriculture, education, and labor?
The gentleman is speaking about a national project for those in the front row, and that plan doesn't recognize that the rest of us are not morons, and the rest of us, Mexicans, we know that we have rights.
Daily Mass Street protests expressed this understanding, rejecting the president's political program that they say privatizes the country's common assets as well as undermines the working poor.
We can't allow them to get rid of our labor rights, acquired after years, and not one worker should be laid off.
Labor and social organizations are mobilizing to reverse and annul the reforms that they ultimately believe will benefit an elite sector.
The multinationals are not going to bring development or progress to the country. The multinationals are going to ransack our resources and exploit it.
Yet with the human rights crisis sharpened by the Ayotzinapa case, Mexico's president will now contend with fleeing foreign investment and a disenfranchised population even more emboldened to challenge the implementation of his policies. Clayton Khan, teleSUR, Mexico City.
5 years after, journalist Juan Carlos Cruz demanded the state of Honduras assume responsibility for the violent attack he suffered from the hands of several police officers while covering the 2009 coup d'etat. A tribunal has taken initial measures, ordering 2 officers to publicly apologize to the journalist.
Several police officers were hitting 4 young men. One of them got his arm fractured, another had his shoulder dislocated, and the others were hit towards taking pictures of what was happening, because there were approximately 15 policemen hitting them when they were already detained. Some were in the patrol cars and others on the floor. When the police saw me, they attacked me and took my camera. They broke it and then they accused me of attacking the national police.
This is the first apology from police or military for their actions since 2009 against the citizenship. Since the coup, 44 journalists have been murdered, with only 3 of these cases being investigated. There have not been any detentions or possible suspects.
De acuerdo a nuestro registro, nosotros tenemos 47.
According to our figures, we have 47 murders in 10 years. With 40 taking place after the coup d'etat. We have always said as a other human rights organizations that the crimes against journalists started because of the coup. And it is very likely that those who died, for example the 12 dead in 2010, were victims of political crimes, because there were journalists that opposed the coup.
Today, Honduras is one of the world's most dangerous countries to be a journalist, with 7 murdered this year alone. The fact that the authorities continue to pay little attention to the problem reflects the vulnerability that the whole population lives in. Gerardo Torres, teleSUR, Central America.